Welcome back to day 4, everyone. Over the last few days, we've been taking a look at sort of how and what and why and when we eat. And we've been taking some notes about how what we're eating and when we're eating and why we're eating makes us, how it makes us feel, not just physically, but how it makes us feel mentally and emotionally. And today we begin the process of starting to eliminate some of those items that don't serve us and that won't be beneficial in our progression in our health and wellness journeys. And so today we're going to start removing some items slowly from consumption as we work our way toward our Ayurvedic cleanse or the mono diet of Khichdi. And so today for our yoga practice, I'd like for us to do a yin practice together, because this process of starting to eliminate some of these things from the diet can be not only very challenging, but also very emotional, because a lot of the ways that we eat and the things that we eat are tied to our emotions. So today we're going to do a hip-focused yin yoga practice, because for me and for many people that I speak with, moving in this way through the hip region really helps to release some emotions. So you might feel some emotions bubbling up throughout the practice today, and I encourage you to feel those, to process those, and to let them move through you rather than trying to kind of push them down or hide them or ignore them. So we want to go through this process of kind of processing the emotions, digesting the emotions, so that we can move forward feeling a little bit lighter without those heavy emotions kind of weighing us down. Okay. So we're going to get started right away, and then I'm going to share with you some passages from a book that many of you have heard me read from before called The Path of the Yoga Sutra. So let's go ahead and get set up for our practice, and then I'll begin reading some of that for you. Of course, for yin yoga, you'll want to have a bolster or some kind of cushion from a couch or a couple of firm pillows. A few blankets, I'm sitting on mine right now, a couple of blankets can be handy. And then blocks are nice for propping as well. And I want to just take a few moments just to kind of bring some gentle movement into our bodies first before we settle in for the yin practice. So if you'll go ahead and get set up on your hands and knees for cat and cow. And you can use a blanket underneath of your knees like you normally would if you'd like to spread that out and have some extra cushion. And then make sure that your knees are stacked above your hips and your shoulders are stacked above your wrists. And when you inhale, lift your tailbone, sink your belly, lift your chest. When you exhale, tuck your tailbone round your spine, take your chin to your chest. And then alternate back and forth between this extension and flexion, just bringing some gentle movement into the spine. So our practice today is going to primarily be hip focused, but our spine is attached to our pelvis, so we can't isolate really just one area of the body. And it's nice to go ahead and start bringing some movement and increasing mobility in these areas before we get started. So you can cycle a few times more through cat and cow, or begin to wave your tail from side to side, bringing a little bit of lateral or side to side movement into those spinal joints, almost like you're curling your spine into the shape of a letter C. And maybe just once or twice more from side to side, and then we'll take this lateral or side to side motion into big circles. So you can circle the hips all the way back and around. Doesn't matter which way you go first. We're just trying to bring some mobility, not just into the spine, but now moving a little more into the hip joint as the hips press out to the side, back and around. Let's do one more in the direction that you're currently moving. And then begin to slowly change the direction. So you just shift the hips off to the other side, back and around. Good, and one more in this direction. And as you complete that circle, bring your big toes together, take your knees wide. Press your seat all the way back to your heels, stretching through the low back. There's a nice stretch in that space between the shoulder blades. As you release your forehead closer to the floor, you can get a gentle stretch in the back of the neck. Good, take 1 or 2 more breaths here in Balasana, your child's pose. And then as you inhale again, start to work your way back up to hands and knees, and then arrange your props so that you'll have a comfortable seat. So what I'm going to do is use one blanket that I'll fold into thirds to make a prop to sit on. And then you'll want to have your bolster or pillows or whatever you're using as a more supportive prop. You'll want to have that nearby. We're going to come to sit on the blanket if you're using one, with the soles of the feet together and the knees out wide, so sitting like a butterfly. Okay. And then I'd like you to try and slide the heels a little bit further away from your body for this particular practice. So rather than pulling them in close to the pelvis like we normally would, we're going to slide the heels away, and you'll have quite a big diamond shape here that you've created with your legs. Now we do want to get some stretch on the inner thighs in this posture, so we don't want to eliminate all of the sensation that we feel, but if you feel particularly strong sensation in the hip joints or in the knees, you can grab a couple of extra blankets, roll them up and place them underneath of your thighs. Or you can use your blocks, if you won't need them for your bolster, to place underneath of your knees or your thighs. And you can always push pause on this video, grab the additional props that you need, and then come back. And then I'm going to take the bolster in between my legs, and I'm going to use one block on the outsides of my feet, so right up at the tips of my toes, to create a ramp with the bolster. Now you might find that this doesn't quite work for you, or it's not elevated enough. If you need a little more elevation, you can use 2 blocks, where you'll place one block on its lowest level, one block on its highest level, stacking and making a little tower, and then leaning the bolster into the blocks like a ramp. And then you can even bring the bolster closer to you by placing a blanket on the bolster. And from here, we're just going to round forward. So you want the spine to round. If you have a healthy spine, you don't have any issues with bone density, you don't have any bulging or herniated discs, you can let your spine round just as much as it feels comfortable and let your forehead come to rest on your props. Now, if you do have some issues with bone density, if you have osteoporosis or osteopenia, or you have bulging or herniated discs, you'll want to keep the spine a little bit more extended, so a little bit more towards moving into a back bending shape. So you don't have to be full extension. You can let the spine soften just a little bit and then release the forehead forward. If you're keeping a more extended spine, you might need to fold a blanket in half to support your forehead, so you won't fold quite as far, or you might even need to prop the bolster a little bit higher. If blocks are not propping the bolster high enough for you, then I suggest taking the bolster to the outsides of your feet, so right in front of your toes, leaning it toward you, holding onto it with your hands, and then letting your forehead come to rest on the bolster. From there, the weight of your head should support the bolster, and you won't need to hold on to it with your hands any longer, so you can release your hands down to your feet or your shins or your ankles. So I'm going to give you just a little bit of time to arrange your props and find a comfortable place to be. And then for today's practice, we're going to hold each of these yin postures for only about 2 to 3 minutes. I know some of you are used to holding the yin postures a little bit longer. this isn't a class about yin yoga, so we won't go into the length of the hold. But if you do want to hold the postures a little bit longer, of course, you're welcome to press pause, grab a timer, hold each pose for up to 5 minutes, and then resume the video after your timer's gone off. But we're going to hold together today for about 2 to 3 minutes in each posture. So hopefully by now you've arranged your props and you're getting settled in. Let's take a deep breath in through the nose and just sigh it out through the mouth and really feel yourself settle into place here. So this process of eliminating some of these things that we're consuming that don't really serve our health and well-being can be extremely difficult. And in yoga philosophy, we call this process of creating habits and practices that are positive and beneficial, we call this tapas, T-A-P-A-S. And I'd like to read from the Path of the Yoga Sutras while we're practicing today, Nikolai Bachman's commentary on the practice of tapas. He begins by saying, make a change. Feel the heat of resistance. Melt away your old habits and burn through any ruinous conditioning. Offer negative behavior into the fire of tapas and chart your course toward freedom. So the word tapas, it means to burn. It means fire. In yoga tradition, fire has always played a very important and integral role. If we look all the way back to the Vedas, sort of the starting point of where yoga philosophy evolved from, we see that the main practice of yoga was the sacrificial fire, building a fire and offering a sacrifice so that you might gain some boon in this worldly life. So fire has always played an important role in the yoga philosophy. As we're beginning this process of eliminating what is no longer serving us, we too are creating a fire, a heat, a burning within. So we're offering all of these old habits, all of these foods and beverages and maybe even things like social media and electronics, all of these things that we're consuming that are no longer serving us are going into this fire, offering these negative behaviors into the sacrificial fire so that we may gain clarity, freedom, health, and well-being in this body. Just let your breath settle. In this practice of yin yoga, there's no particular way that you need to be breathing. If ujjayi breath makes sense for you right now, feel free to deepen your breath. But if a soft and gentle breath is what's serving you in this process of letting go, just stick with that soft and gentle breath. And then as you're preparing to move your body, just start slowly, first by observing where you feel and notice the most sensation. Be alert and mindful of those places where you're feeling sensation as you very slowly begin to lift yourself back up towards a seated position. As you come up to seated, you'll want to unbuild your props. And then you're invited to move in whatever ways feel good to you. But if you need a few ideas, it's always really helpful to bring the knees together and stretch out the legs. Once the legs are stretched out, you might like to just slowly bounce them up and down. Maybe make some circles with your ankles or wiggle your toes, just bringing some movement back into the legs. It's also really nice to take the hands behind the hips and then deepen the extension of your spine by lifting your chest. If it feels okay in the back of your neck, you can even lift your gaze. And then once you're back upright, you might like to make a few circles, rolling your shoulders up and back and down and up and back and down. Good. So for our next posture, we're going to remain seated. So you'll be on the edge of your blanket or whatever kind of props you were using here. The legs will stretch out in front. A couple of different ways that you can use the props here. You can keep the legs together. Bring a bolster on the tops of the thighs. Let the bolster support your belly and your chest as you fold forward and rest your forehead down. Now you might need to invite in a block or even a folded blanket to raise the height of the bolster for your forehead to meet it. So this is one way that you can use the props here. If you have two blocks, another way that you might use your props here is to build like a Stonehenge. So you'll put one block at its highest height on either side of your legs. I usually take mine right about knee level. That's just what works for my body, and you'll have to adjust that distance based on the length of your own legs and your own torso. Then you'll place the bolster on top of those two blocks. So it's a bit like a table that you can fold forward onto. So you can stack up your forearms and rest your forehead down, or just rest your arms at your sides and let your forehead come all the way down to your bolster. If you need a little more height in the bolster than either of those two options, then instead of keeping the legs together, you can take the legs just wide enough for the bolster to fit in between your legs. And then you'll give it just a little bit of a squeeze. It won't be enough to hold it up. You'll still have to support it with your hands for now. But you'll lean the bolster toward you, like I showed you in the version of butterfly pose, and let your forehead lean into the bolster. Once your head's leaning into the bolster, there should be enough tension to support the bolster without the work of your upper body, so you can release your hands down onto your lap or onto your shins. So unlike in restorative yoga, with yin yoga, we do want to feel some sensation. So you are trying to feel some stretch in your hamstrings. Now, it doesn't have to feel like the deepest stretch you've ever had. It doesn't have to feel like you're all the way at your max. In fact, you don't even want to go all the way to your limit or all the way to your max. You want to stop before you hit that edge. But you do want to feel some stretch. So make sure you're folding far enough forward that you're feeling some stretch in the backs of your legs. And how far you fold will be very dependent to your own body, very specific to you. So you can make some adjustments with your props, and I'll give you a few moments to do that before we get ready to settle all the way in. And then once you're arranged here, again, take a breath to settle by breathing in through your nose. And as you open your mouth and sigh your breath out, just let everything go into these props. Nikolai Bachman continues on by saying the practice of yoga is part of a long and gradual process of deliberate external and internal transformation. Tapas, which is the third of the 5 niyamas or personal practices, is the practice of actually implementing our plan for self-improvement. Tapas is the practice of actually implementing our plan for self-improvement. So we know that sugar, caffeine, and various other foods and beverages that we may consume are not entirely healthy for us. And this is the opportunity to start enacting a plan for self-improvement. For noticing how much we're consuming these foods, for noticing when we're consuming these foods, for noticing why we're consuming these foods. And that's such an important one, the why. The word tapas derives from the root word tap, which means to heat. Real and permanent change in behavior creates heat from the friction of a new positive pattern rubbing up against the old negative one. This priceless heat of discomfort is the result of tapas. It can arise while we're exercising, while we're breaking an old habit, or while we're changing our direction in life or doing any other activity that causes positive change. The heat generated by practicing tapas will incinerate any physical, mental, and emotional impurities and refine the body, the sensory organs, and eventually the heart-mind. Again, if you'd like to stay here longer, you can press pause, set a timer, and then resume the video when you're ready to move on. Otherwise, I again invite you just to begin noticing where you're feeling sensation, being alert and mindful to those sensations as you slowly start to lift back up to seated. Once you unbuild your props and you return to seated, take just another moment to move your body in whatever ways feel nice for you. So again, another little shake of the legs, sitting back into the hands and lifting the chest to extend the spine. And then as you're making your way back up to seated, bring your right knee towards your chest and just take your hands in front of your right shin. I like to cross the left leg towards the right corner of the mat, so just moving that left leg over at a diagonal, and step the right foot to the outside of the left knee. You're going to keep holding onto your right shin with your left hand. Take your right hand behind your hip, extend up through the crown of your head, and then as you exhale, rotating your torso to the right. Good, breathing in and breathing out. And then releasing that twist, turning forward. Good. Uncrossing the legs. Slide that left leg back over so it's in line with your hip joint. Extend the right leg forward. And then hug the left knee up towards the chest. Both hands go in front of the shin. Right leg moves at a diagonal towards the left corner of the mat so you can step the left foot across to the outside of the right knee. Take the left hand behind the hip, right hand holding onto the left shin. Rotate the torso around to the left. Breathe in. And breathe out. And then as you inhale again, you'll start to turn forward. So a lot of times when we think about doing postures that are hip openers, we think mostly of this outer hip, so things like pigeon pose. The hip actually has 4 quadrants, right? So there's the back of the hip joint around the hamstring area, which we just stretched. There's the inside of the hip joint, or around this sort of inner thigh groin area, which we got with our butterfly pose. There's the front of the hip joint, which we'll get with hip flexor and quadricep stretching. And then there's what we often think of, this outer hip, the IT band area, which we'll get here in just a few moments. But we're going to move to the front of the hip joint now with what we call in yin yoga some dragon poses. So you'll want to spread out a blanket underneath of your knees for comfort. And then just make sure that your other props, like your blocks and your bolster, are closer to the front end of your mat. Now for dragon pose, we're going to hold these even less time than what we've held the other postures. We've been about 3 minutes in the 2 forward folds so far. We're going to be here in each side of dragon pose once we get settled in, just for about a minute, because these are not quite as yin-like as the other postures, but I want to make sure that we get that hip joint in a very balanced way. So you'll come to hands and knees. Your knees will be on your blanket here. And then I already know that I want to use my bolster for this, so I'm going to move the bolster onto the mat in front of my right knee. And then the hands will be kind of on either side of the bolster. From here, I'm just going to bring the left leg forward, and I want the left foot to be a little bit wider than my hip joint. So I'm moving the left foot out to the left edge of the mat. Now, a lot of times this can bring a stretch into this outer hip. And like I said before, it's really impossible to isolate just one part of the body. So you will feel some stretch in this outer hip. But really what we're going for is a stretch in the front of your right quadricep muscle here. So everybody's going to do something a little bit different to feel the stretch in the front of the right hip. And what I'm going to do, and I'll show you first, is really let my hips sink forward. I've got this bolster back far enough that as my hip drops down, it supports the front of my right thigh. So I'm going to have a little bit of support there on the right thigh. And then my hand just rests nicely on the bolster. So you can just bring your hand down to the bolster. But for me, keeping the torso upright, tucking the tailbone and lifting the hip points in the front of the pelvis gets into that hip flexor area, or the front of the hip joint. You might find that you need a little extra height for your hands, in which case you could bring a block onto your bolster. Okay, so this is one variation. Now, for some of you, getting the right thigh down far enough to touch the bolster just won't happen based on how your body is put together, how your skeleton is designed. So if you don't get into this deep of a lunge and you're not able to get that stretch on the front of the right quadricep muscle, I'm going to recommend just shifting this bolster out of the way, coming all the way upright, bringing your hands to the top of your left thigh. And then as much as you can, shift forward. So again, it might not be enough to get the front of that thigh to rest on the bolster, but as much as you can, shift forward, and then really focus on the tilt of your pelvis. So the tailbone goes down and the pubic bone comes up. Keep the left hand on the top of the left thigh and reach the right arm up towards the sky. So those are a few options. If you need to make some additional adjustments so that you feel the stretch in the front of the right hip flexor and quadricep muscle, make those adjustments. Take a deep breath in through your nose. Sigh it out. And then just settle in here. You might even close your eyes. Bring your awareness to your breath. Take a moment just to notice if there's anything emotional that comes up for you as we work through these stretches. Tapas, along with self-observation, or what we call svadhyaya, and faith or letting go, what we call ishvara pranidhana, makes up the yoga of action, a powerful triad of tools for weakening our mental and emotional afflictions and moving toward complete attention. So tapas, along with self-observation and letting go, makes up what we call the yoga of action. And this yoga of action is a set of tools that weakens our mental and emotional afflictions. The primary mental and emotional affliction is desire. So it weakens our desires and moves us toward a state of freedom. So however you are arranged in this lunge, slowly start to make your way back out. Come back towards your hands and knees. As you come back to your hands and knees, you might like to do a round or two of cat and cow or move your hips around in circles. And then adjust your props for the second side. So I'm going to just move this bolster over to the front of my left leg and step the right foot to the outer edge of the mat. Now you might find that your two sides are quite different, and you'll get a different sensation with a different type of action on the second side. So if your pose doesn't look exactly the same on this side as it did on the first side, it's no big deal. Just do what you need to do to feel the stretch in the hip flexor in the front of the quads. So again, I'm going to drop that left hip forward to rest on the bolster, and then use my hand to help lift the torso and really focus on tucking the tailbone under and lifting the front heads of the pelvis up. This can be option one. You can raise your hand up on a block if you need more height with the torso. Option two can just be to shift out of this altogether, hands to the top of the thigh. Lean forward just as much as you can. Main focus is on tailbone down, pubic bone up. Left arm can stretch up. Once you have things adjusted here as you like them, take a deep breath in and out. Change is an inevitable quality of nature, and stagnation or staying the same goes against nature's ebb and flow. In our body, our muscles tighten up, our opinions become rigid, and our habits solidify. Tapas causes heat and thus change, and therefore can prevent obstructions from forming in our body, in our breath, or in our heart-mind. One of the most common forms of tapas is doing a sequence of yoga postures with enough effort to release heat by stretching and strengthening the muscles in the body. And then slowly start to back out. And as you come back to your hands and knees again, you might like to take another round of cat and cow or move the hips around in circles. And then go ahead and move that blanket that you're kneeling on. So we're going to get to the outer hip joint now, and I'll show you a couple of different variations for doing this. The first one is what we call sleeping swan. Most of you are familiar with it. It looks like pigeon pose from Hatha Yoga. So let me show you this setup, and then I'll show you the second setup, and then you can choose which works best for you. If you already know, you can start making your way there. We're going to start with the right leg again. So the right knee comes forward towards the wrist. The left leg stays extended back behind. Now, you can do a couple of things if you come into this variation. In Hatha Yoga, we generally keep the hips square. So you're welcome to keep the hips square. Bring a bolster in front of your shin and fold forward here. So you'll feel some stretch on that right outer hip. But in this variation, I get a lot more of stretch actually in my hamstring than what I get in my outer hip. So the variation of this that works best for me to get that outer hip stretch is to let all of my weight sink over into the right hip. That means my pelvis is going to rotate to the left a little. And then as my pelvis rotates to the left, I kind of put a little bit of a bend in this left knee just for comfort. And then once I have all of that, I can rotate my torso back around towards the front of the mat. And there's where I really start to get that stretch on the right outer hip. So you might try this version and see how this feels for you compared to how it feels to have the hips square. Okay, so we've already stretched the hamstring, and it's not wrong to stretch your hamstrings. Again, you can't separate out body parts completely. But if I want to focus on that outer hip area, putting my hip down on the ground actually gives me a better stretch there and less of a stretch in the hamstring. So if this kind of arrangement with your legs works for you, you might try both of those options and see how that goes. If this kind of arrangement does not work in your body and you would prefer, you can come to resting on your back. Now, I'm going to keep a bolster on the mat running parallel to the short edge of the mat. And then as I come down to lie on my back, I'm going to actually rest my feet here on the bolster. And then you'll start by crossing your right leg or your right ankle over your left thigh. Okay. So by having this little lift with the bolster, you don't have to hold the leg in. You can make it much more yin-like. You can even lift your foot higher by placing a block on the bolster and crossing your ankles in this way. Another alternative for this lying on the back version of Sleeping Swan is to move to a wall. So I'm going to slide over here and show you that real quickly if you have a wall nearby. So you'll just be lying down facing the wall. Left foot goes onto the wall, right ankle onto the left thigh. And the closer you get your butt to the wall, the more stretch you'll feel in your right hip. If you walk your left foot to the left a little bit more and kind of let the legs dip to the left, you'll feel more stretch. You'll feel a different kind of stretch. So there are a lot of adjustments you can make here on the wall. Okay, so you choose what works best for you. And you might like this wall variation even if the traditional pigeon pose setup works for you. You might just try this wall variation and see how different it is. For me, it really gives me a different quality of stretch. And if I'm going for that quality of stretch, I actually prefer doing this pose at the wall versus in that more traditional pigeon pose setup. So go ahead, take a moment, decide what's working best for you. And then we'll settle in and be here for about 3 minutes before we change sides. Once you've found the position that works best for you, take a deep breath in through your nose and sigh it out. Habitual behavior causes stagnation. When we consciously change a habit, discomfort arises and creates heat in the body. This is the priceless heat of real change. If we're aware that the discomfort is good for us, it becomes a desirable effect and may encourage our continued practice. Tapas includes consciously challenging our long-standing patterns of behavior and gradually burning them up, resulting in spiritual and physiological growth. Opening up to new ideas and behaviors also creates heat as the circuits in our brain get rewired. For example, think of a strong habit, some action that you've done the same way every day for many years. Let's say the way you brush your teeth. Try and brush your teeth using the opposite hand. Or try to move the toothbrush through your mouth in a different sequence. This change will feel uncomfortable at first, but with enough repetition, a new pattern will form and the movements will become easier. Next, try choosing a habit that you know is obstructing some aspect of your life. Set an intention to make a commitment to change that habit. An attitude of satya, or truthfulness, will help you follow through with your plan. Then begin to slowly start backing out of your posture. If you're on your back, just uncrossing your legs, maybe place both feet down, make some windshield wipers. If you're at the wall, you might uncross and hug both knees to the chest. If you're in a more traditional pigeon pose shape, you could come back to your hands and knees and make some circles or cat and cow. And then start to set up for the second side. And again, when we're working with these more asymmetrical postures, you might find that you need to do something a little bit different on the second side. And it's okay to do things a little bit differently. It doesn't have to look exactly the same. So I'll give you a moment to get your props all set up. When you're ready, you'll take a deep breath in through your nose. Sigh it out. Tapas requires discipline and effort. In Indian lore, a sage would practice tapas and celibacy for thousands of years to accumulate lots of powers. When the gods noticed that their power was threatened, they sent down to earth a beautiful nymph who tried to distract the sage from his meditation. If she succeeded in seducing him, he would lose his seed and thus his power. In yoga, healthy change is necessary for progress to occur. After setting an intention to commit to positive changes in your life, formulate specific actions to take or ways you wish to respond when certain buttons are pushed. Then, with discipline and effort, implement the plan and burn through the negative, harmful patterns. The inevitable pain or discomfort will produce the sweet nectar of positive, lasting, inner transformation. Slowly begin to make your way out of your posture. If you're at the wall, you might want to move back towards your mat. If you're already on your back, you can just stay here. If you've been in a more traditional pigeon shape, you might start to lift yourself up to hands and knees. Just move around in whatever ways that you need to. I'm going to give you 2 suggestions for setting up a shavasana, or of course, you're welcome to take a more traditional shavasana if that works best in your body. First suggestion is to build Stonehenge again. So you'll take 2 blocks on their highest height and then take your bolster across the top, like you're making a table. You're going to use this as a prop for your legs. So you'll sit close to the bolster as you lie down on your back, swing your legs up and let the bend of your knees rest right at the edge of the bolster. So you can rest your hands on your belly, soften your low back. If for some reason this setup doesn't feel good for you, or if your blocks don't feel steady or stable, it feels like you're kind of worried that this whole thing might fall down, you can do the same thing with the bolster under the knees minus the blocks. So you'll just move the blocks out from underneath of the bolster. And then adjust the bolster so that the bend of your knees is right at the edge of the bolster. Soften your low back and relax your legs. And of course, if you prefer Shavasana with no props, please feel free to move those out of the way. As you settle in, take a deep breath in through your nose. Let the breath out through your mouth. And then as you take a moment here in Shavasana, if you haven't already for today, start selecting the items that you would like to remove from your consumption. These might be items like sugar, caffeine, alcohol, red meat. Or they might be things like social media, screen time. Commit to taking these next several days to slowly begin removing these habits. And begin to notice how the removal of these habits makes you feel. Is it refreshing? Is it uncomfortable? Is it difficult? Begin to slowly deepen your breath. Move your fingers and your toes. Make some small movements with your wrists and your ankles. Begin bringing your knees towards your chest. Rock a little from side to side. And slowly start to make your way all the way back up to seated. As you come back up to seated, you can rest with your hands in your lap or together in front of your heart, bowing the wisdom of your head towards the wisdom of your heart. The divine light in me sees and honors the divine light in you. Namaste.